Hi guys. As I wait for everybody to join, I'm just gonna play around with Google for a little bit, including my tiara, and see if there's anything we need to do. I am gonna start broadcasting in about 5 minutes. In the meantime, as you join, please let me know if you have any questions. All right, guys, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to try and make sure that you can ask questions and chat. It looks like you can. So just message me any questions that you have. I am going to wear this funky headset because I think that you'll be able to hear me more clearly, and there won't be as many extra noises, for example, from my dog. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to do a few things today. The first thing that we are going to do is I'm going to show you guys a PowerPoint. Like I said in my announcement, it should take between 30 and 60 minutes. Hopefully it will preemptively answer all of your questions, especially for those of you who cannot be here. And then what we'll do is we'll have an open discussion for about the next hour. And then after that, I am going to have office hours. So just come in when you can and let me know if you have any questions. I do apologize in advance if there's any exterior noises like you. I get my work in when I can and where I can. So anyway, the first thing I want to do is that I want to show you a PowerPoint about your final portfolio, or about all of the questions that you guys have asked me. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. So it looks like you are going to be able to see the notes, but okay, here we go. So let's see if I can get this full screen. If not, that's okay, because you can zoom in and out, and you can also use the links. All right, so welcome to our poetry webinar. I am Angelina Overdan. This webinar is for Southern New Hampshire University. It's English 226, summer 2015. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about reading poetry, imagery, voice, form, writing poetry, gaining confidence in your own writing, workshop expectations, and your final portfolios. So reading poetry. As you go through this class, you want to start reading like a writer. When you're reading like a writer, you're not just reading to get information, you're reading to understand the text and the author's choices. To do this, you should try to figure out how the text or piece is written and how well, understand the author's purpose, determine how and if the author achieves his or her purpose, pay attention and learn from the organization and style. When you're reading poetry, I understand that sometimes reading poetry is intimidating, but it shouldn't be. You've probably been in classes where you've had to search for the meaning of a poem and or find the hidden treasure in it. This is not one of those classes. In this class, I want you to pay attention to images, voice, the writer's choices, including diction, word choice, structure, and general form, and your reaction. Hang on just a second, guys. I want to make sure I can see if you are asking any questions. It's going to take just a second to pull up on my screen. Okay, we're back to where we were. All right, guys, let's start that over. It looks like I've got it figured out, and I can actually see you as well as I can see, not only I can see what I'm showing you, but I can also see you so I can answer any questions. I'm sorry about the problem. Just let me make sure that if it happens right at 4:08. All right, okay, so here we go again. This is our first webinar of the term, which is why we're having a few technical difficulties. Again, this is our poetry webinar. I am Angelina Oberdan. This is Southern New Hampshire University, English 226. So the topics we're going to cover in this presentation are reading poetry, imagery, voice, form, writing poetry, gaining confidence in your own writing, and workshop expectations, and final portfolios. To begin, reading poetry. You're going to start reading like a writer. When you're reading like a writer, you're not just reading to get information, you're also reading to understand the text and the author's choices. To do this, you should try to figure out how a text or a piece of text is written and how well, understand the author's purpose, determine how and if the author achieves his or her purpose, and pay attention and learn from the organization and style. When you're reading poetry, it's sometimes intimidating, I understand, but it shouldn't be. You've probably been in classes where you've had to search for the meaning of a poem and find the hidden treasure in it, but this is not one of those classes. When you're reading poetry, what I want you to pay attention to is the images, the voice, the writer's choices, so the diction, which is word choice, syntax or sentence structure, and the general form, and then your reaction. You all did really well on imagery. Let me go back for just a second. These 4 things are what we're going to discuss next, okay? So as far as images and imagery goes, you all did really well with the imagery discussion board, so I'm interested in what your questions are. Again, you can use the group chat feature to access any of those and ask any of those questions. Here's a couple important quotes. First of all, images are living pictures. The movie in the reader's mind that your writing creates on the mental screen of the reader. Images are real. When you dream, you see things. The same with reading. When you're reading a great piece of writing, your imagination is activated. You can see and smell and hear and touch. Remember that images are concrete and not abstract. When Shakespeare said, "Love is like a rose," he was creating a really simple image to help us understand what love is. That's what you should do in your own writing. Help us understand those abstract things like love. In grad school, I asked, and this is why I know that imagery is so important. In graduate school, I asked my major professor what he looks for in student applications, and he said he looks for images because form is teachable, but being able to convey a strong image shows focus and attention and the potential of the writer. So especially in this point in your writing career, you really want to focus on images. Next, we're going to talk about voice. Voice is what we're focusing on this week, so there's a lot of resources for you in the module. Remember that the voice of the poem is different from the voice of the author. We usually refer to the voice of the poem as the speaker. In that way, there's no confusion, especially in persona poems. It detaches the author from what he or she writes. In your discussion board, this week, you also want to think about how the voices of two poems differ. So pay attention to diction, syntax, etc. We'll talk about those next. I do want to show you a link to this really interesting website. I went ahead and showed it to you, and then let me pull it up on this screen as well. Okay, let me show you this link. Sorry that it's taking a minute. Okay, you can also pull it up on your own screen, but just in case, I wanted to show it to you too. This is about finding your own voice, how to find your poetic voice. Now, many years ago, a poetry professor told me that I wasn't ready for grad school because I didn't have a poetic voice. A budding poet, that was difficult to hear. Well, once I got over my initial hurt feelings, I realized that I didn't have a clear working definition of poetic voice. So I set out to find one, the goal of honing my voice and the hope that with the knowledge I might gain, I'd land myself in a graduate program. So it turns out that poetic voice is difficult to define, but it has to do with the distinctive characteristics of a particular poet's work. Often it has to do with a poet's opera of work, so their whole collection, or with the voice of a particular poem, or speaker. Okay? So the first thing you want to know is that poetic voice is rooted in the use and repetition of specific elements. So the technical elements that make a poem recognizable, which we're going to talk about next, as belonging to one particular poet. The writer has identified these elements as grammar, syntax, form, music, subject matter, and last, magic, the elusive connection between the reader and the poet that transcends the work. So we're just going to go through these things very quickly. The first one is grammar or syntax. And essentially what it's saying is that the way that a specific poem or poet uses syntax, it affects the way we read it. So she asked these questions. How do you use grammar in your poetry? Is your use consistent? Do you have good reasons for the things you do? What happens when you play with grammar in a specific poem? For instance, how does the poem read with no punctuation? Or if you over-punctuate it, how do these things affect the poem as a whole? When I first started writing, I tended to, I lowercased all of my I's because I didn't think I was important. In general, in my life, I didn't have very much self-confidence, and I didn't think the I of the poem was important because I was important. Well, one of my teachers told me is that I had to capitalize I's because within each specific poem, you couldn't tell if the speaker didn't think he or she was important. So it's a good thing to learn in the importance of grammar to a particular poem, but then overall to all of your work and all of your writing. Now, syntax is the order in which words are arranged. They can make a line read smoothly or not. It can create a distance or a closeness. It can convey feeling. For example, Langston Hughes wrote much of his poetry for a working class audience. In his organization, as well as his word choices, he uses some slang as opposed to really complicated, complex, or compound sentences that you might have learned about in your first or second year composition classes. Okay, now the next thing is form, which we're going to talk about more to come. Right now, voice, I wouldn't worry too much about form and overall poetic voice. I would worry about figuring out in the specific poems that we look at the voice of those poems. Now, there is this idea of music that I do want to pay attention to. So what can music do to support voice? Alliteration, rhyme, assonance, which is vowel sounds, prosody, and actual sounds of the letters can all contribute to the music of the poem. The poet Stephen Dobbins points out that specific sounds evoke certain emotions. Consonant plosives, so they're the sounds that are made by D, B, P, C, T, and K. They're also often related to our cuss words. They lend themselves to a fast pace and explosive action. When making those sounds, the mouth exhales a puff of air, often with force. So think about like a plosive, like a P. Often with force. In contrast, the consonant sounds that are longer in duration, so F's, fuzz, S's and generals, I's, whs, they provide a soft sound and a calmer feeling. So just using those sounds in your poems can determine your voice. And when you guys look at the poems in the discussion board this week, hopefully that this idea of music and sounds will help you. The next one is the subject matter. We're only looking at specific poems from specific poems from two specific poets. Since we're not looking at their whole opera of work, you can't really make a generalization about all that one poet or the other writes about. We are looking at Yusuf Komenkawa's poem, and he does often write about the Vietnam War, but you don't necessarily need to know that. So for now, just think about the subject matter of the specific poems and how that relates to the choices that the poet is making in those two poems that you're asked to analyze in the discussion board. Now, the magic is really interesting. I like how she describes this. The writer says, once you become accustomed to playing with poetic elements, you'll come to know which changes to stick with and which to file away. You'll know because when a poem works, when its voice is right, some new truth is shared between the writer and the reader. The voice of the poem transcends its parts. When that happens, you know success. You've succeeded as a poet. Be mindful of your voice. Play with it. Oops, I lost my screen. Hi, guys. Well, anyway, because you can pull this up on your own computer. She says that be mindful of your voice, play with it, make careful connections as you construct your poems. Your hard work will result in poetry that makes connections, imparts wisdom, and is a joy to read and write. My exploration of voice has led to a greater understanding of my own abilities and taught me how to manipulate my own voice. Depending on the poem or the poem and the subject matter. So back to our PowerPoint. Just keep in mind, this was good for when you're writing and for when you're reading, that the voice of the poem is different from the voice of the author. We usually refer to the voice of the poem as the speaker. So not necessarily, so when you're looking at those two poems, don't talk about what Elizabeth Bishop says. Instead, talk about the speaker of one art and what she's doing. Remember, this is also nice for you, because if you want to write about some very personal things in your poems, you're more than welcome to, but it kind of gives you license to do it, because your reader shouldn't understand that your speaker is exactly the same as you are. Again, just to remind you, since this is what we're doing this week, in your discussion board, you want to think about how the voices of the two poems differ. One art by Elizabeth Bishop and Yusef Komenkawa's poem, I forget, its title will be easy right now, but Yusef Komenkawa's poem too. What you'll find is that they both have very different voices. So next we're going to talk about form. Form is not just the type of poem, sonnet, free verse, etc. Form also refers to the choices that the writer makes about how the poem appears on the page. The writer's choices, we've talked about these because these are all almost all part of voice too. These include diction, syntax, and general form, including meter and rhyme or lack thereof. More than anything, I'd like you to pay attention to line breaks, make conscious choices about the sound and the content of each line, and just pay attention to where you're breaking your lines. Really, a lot of form concerns are addressed in further poetry classes, but there are a couple of places in your text that I want to highlight. These include in the practice of creative writing, chapter 7, all of it, and then chapter 8, ways to be unwise, what not to do. And then in writing down the bones, if you haven't gotten there yet, syntax, the chapter called syntax is really good for this too. All right, and next we're going to talk about writing poetry. Most of you have already submitted your poems for the week, but just in case you haven't, and in your further poetry writing, there's a few things that I wanted to go over. First of all, what's most important is to get your thoughts and ideas on your paper and then revise. You want to add images so that you really show your reader what you want to. When you revise, pay attention to your choices, including diction, so word choice, syntax, and sentence structure, line breaks, meter, and rhyme are fine, but make sure they're intentional. And then remember that everything that you put on the page of your poem is important. Okay? So I want to show you, there's also a couple of resources for this that I want to show you. Okay, let me find that, please. This is the first writing tips on how to write a poem. These are also in the notes, but just in case you're here, I want you to have them. This is the second. It is from Writer's Digest. These are all nice little listicles, just to kind of help you get started. Okay. So the next thing that a lot of you asked me to talk about is building confidence in your own writing. So let's go back to my PowerPoint and we will talk about that. All right. So a lot of our readings will help you build confidence, but there are some things to remember. First and foremost, you have a unique perspective. The way that you look at the world is different from the way everyone else does, and your writing and that perspective is interesting. You have interesting and important things to say. Be confident in what you have to say, and you are good at this, even if only because you're trying. That makes you good. That makes you better than everyone else who isn't trying. So one of my favorite essays is called Shitty First Drafts by Annie Lamott, because she reminds us that even professional writers have to write crappy first drafts. The best way to build confidence is to write that terrible draft and then revise it. You'll immediately see your own success. Let me pull this up really quickly for you. And I will share it with you. And then let me just show this. We'll just go through this together really fast. We've got plenty of time. Okay, so you can pull this up on your own screen or you can look at it with me. Either way is fine. I am going to zoom in a little bit, and we're going to stop this header. Or we're going to skip this header. Bird by Bird, just as a side note, Bird by Bird is another, if you enjoy Natalie Goldberg's writing down the bones, Bird by Bird is also a really good essay. So Annie Lamott says that now practically even better news than that of short assignments is the idea of shitty first drafts. All good writers write them. This is how they end up with good second drafts and terrific third drafts. People tend to look at successful writers who are getting their books published and maybe even doing well financially and think that they sit down at their desk every morning feeling like $1 million, feeling great about who they are and how much talent they have and what a great story they have to tell. That they take a few deep breaths, push back their sleeves, roll their necks a few times to get all the crooks out and in, typing fully formed passages as fast as a court reporter. But this is just the fantasy of the uninitiated. I know some very great writers you love who write beautifully and have made a great deal of money, and not one of them sits down routinely feeling wildly enthusiastic and confident. Not one of them writes elegant first drafts. All right, one of them does, but we do not like her very much. We do not think she has a rich inner life or that God likes her or can even stand her. Although when I mentioned this to my priest friend Tom, he said you can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates the same people you do. Very few writers really know what they're doing until they've done it. Nor do they go about their business feeling dewy and thrilled. They do not type a few stiff warm-up sentences and then find themselves bounding along like huskies across the snow. One writer I know tells me that he sits down every morning and says to himself nicely, "It's not like you don't have a choice, because you do. You can either type or work yourself." We all often feel like we're pulling teeth, even those writers whose prose ends up being the most natural and fluid. The right words and sentences just do not come pouring out like ticker tape most of the time. Now, Muriel Spark is said to have felt that she was taking dictation from God every morning, sitting there, one supposes, plugged into a dictaphone, typing away, humming, but this is a very hostile and aggressive position. One might hope for bad things to rain down on a person like this. For me and most of the other writers I know, writing is not rapturous. In fact, the only way I can get anything written is to write really, really, really shitty first drafts. The first draft is the child's draft. This is where you let it all pour out and then let it romp all over the place, knowing that no one is going to see it and that you can shape it later. You just let this childlike part of you channel whatever voices and visions come through onto the page. If one of the characters wants to say, "Well, so what, Mr. Poopy Pants?" you let her. No one is going to see it. If the kid wants to get into really sentimental, weepy, emotional territory, you let him. Just get it down on paper, because there may be something great in those 6 crazy pages that you would never have gotten to by more rational grown-up means. There may be something in the very last line of the very last paragraph on page 6 that you just love. that is so beautiful or wild that you now know you're supposed to be writing about, more or less, and in what direction you might go. But there is no way to get there, to get this without first getting through the first 5.5 pages. Now, I have a really similar experience to Annie Lamont because I've written a lot of book reviews. But I'll read hers and then I'll tell you mine. She says that I used to write food reviews for California Magazine before it folded. My writing food reviews had nothing to do with the magazine folding. Just every single review did cause a couple of canceled subscriptions. Some readers took umbrage at my comparing mounds of vegetable puree with various ex-presidents' brains. These reviews always took 2 days to write. First, I go to the restaurant several times with a few opinionated, articulate friends in tow. I'd sit there writing down anything anyone said that was at all interesting or funny. Then on the following Monday, I'd sit down on my desk with my notes and try to write the review. Even after I'd been doing this for years, panic would set in. I'd try to write a lead, but instead I'd write a couple of dreadful sentences, X them out, try again, X everything out, and then feel despair and worry settle on my chest like an X-ray apron. It's over, I think, calmly. I'm not going to be able to get the magic to work this time. I'm ruined. I'm through. I'm toast. Maybe I think I can get my old job back as a clerk typist, but probably not. I'd get up and study my teeth in the mirror for a while. Then I'd stop, remember to breathe, take a few phone calls, hit the kitchen, and chow down. Eventually, I'd go back and sit down at my desk and sigh for the next 10 minutes. Finally, I would pick up my 1-inch picture frame, stare into it as if for an answer, and every time the answer would come, all I had to do was write a really shitty first draft of, say, the opening paragraph. No one was going to see it. This is true for me too. Like I said, I had a similar experience. I've written a lot of book reviews. And even those book reviews, I have to write a shitty first draft of. I have to write a really bad first draft. Once I'm through with that really bad first draft, then I can go back and revise it. I have to get that first one done. So what Annie Lamont says, she says, so I'd start writing without reining myself in. Almost just typing, just making my fingers move. And the writing would be terrible. I'd write a lead paragraph that was a whole page, even though the entire review could only be 3 pages long. And then I'd start writing up descriptions of food, one dish at a time, bird by bird, and the critics would be sitting on my shoulders commenting like cartoon characters. They'd be pretending to snore or rolling their eyes at my overwrought descriptions. No matter how hard I tried to tone those descriptions down, no matter how conscious I was of what my friend said to me gently in my ear, and she said, it's just a piece of chicken. It's just a bit of cake. But because by then I'd been writing for so long, I would eventually let myself trust the process. Sort of, more or less. I'd write the first draft that was maybe twice as long as it should be, with a self-indulgent and boring beginning, stupidifying descriptions of the meal, lots of quotes from my black humored friends that made them sound more like the Manson girls than food lovers, and no ending to speak of. Notice that this is what she actually does in this essay. Anyway, the whole thing would be so long and incoherent and hideous that for the rest of the day I'd obsess about getting creamed by a car before I could write a decent second draft. I'd worry that people would read what I'd written and believe that the accident had really been a suicide, that I had panicked because my talent was waning and my mind was shot. The next day I'd sit down, go through it all with a colored pen, take out everything I found, and find a new lead somewhere on the second page, figure out a kicky place to end it, and then write a second paragraph. A second draft. It always turned out fine, sometimes even funny and weird and helpful. I'd go over it one more time and mail it in. Then, a month later, it was time for another review. The whole process would start again, complete with the fears that people would find my first draft before I could rewrite it. Almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting something, anything, down on paper. A friend of mine says that the first draft is the down draft. You just get it down. The second draft is the up draft. You fix it up. You try to say what you have to say more accurately. And the third draft is the dental draft, where you check every tooth to see if it's loose or cramped, decayed, or even, God help us, healthy. All right. So that was Annie Lamont's shitty first drafts. We are going to go back to our presentation. And this time we're going to talk about workshop and what you're going to do in workshop. Essentially what I want is I want to go through the rubric with you. I know that you can read it by yourselves, but I also want to be able to show it to you and just sort of go through it if you want to. I'm going to see if I can copy this. Sorry guys, I disappeared for a minute. Let me find the rubric for you so that I can share it with you, and then we will go through it together. All right. Here is the rubric for you. If you go into attachments, you should be able to see it. All right. And then we are going to look at this together. How's it going? Oh, I'm sorry, I just reshared shitty first drafts with you. Let's try this again. You may have to log in to access this. If you do, that's okay, because I'm going to project it in just a minute. Yeah, you're going to have to log in. Okay, let me just project this for you on screen, and we'll go through it together. So here's what you need to do for workshop. Basically, the cornerstone of every successful writing workshop is an environment of trust and respect. You're going to be doing this in all of your creative writing classes. As a reviewer, you serve as an editor, facilitator, coach, and midwife. Yours is the role of a compassionate professional. The author, too, is a professional who thanks reviewers for their feedback, avoids defensive reactions and commentary, and tries to maintain an objective ear. The overarching goal of workshop is to help each writer achieve his or her own goals. So workshop is always a dynamic undertaking, and you'll become more familiar with your peers and their writing as you get used to this. So we are doing this for every genre, okay? So as a reviewer, take the time to read a piece thoroughly. You'll likely need to read it through several times. You might want to read the piece in its entirety and then jot down your first impressions. Then you'll want to read it a second and even a third time to develop your critique. Remember that you are critiquing the piece and not the person. Your goal is to help the author achieve his or her goal. Keep your personal judgment to yourself, or about the subject matter to yourself. Don't even worry about that. You may not be the intended audience for the piece, but to the best of your ability, you need to analyze it as if you were the intended audience. Use the assignment's objectives to focus the critique. For example, if the assignment is about crafting believable characters, or exploring nonfiction genre of memoir, or creating a properly structured yet evocative haiku, consider that as a primary area for analysis. Next, suggest areas for revision. Keep the tone positive and provide concrete suggestions for their revision. For example, you want to say things like, the story really starts to grab my attention in the second paragraph. For the next draft, I consider starting the story there. You could weave some more important details in, such as the date that the grandmother died, or the first paragraph, from the first paragraph to the second. Don't say the beginning needs fixing. It's so confusing. Be much, much more specific than that. Also, you want to leave a final comment that says something about, that should be an overall summary of the piece in your impressions, mainly focusing on the positive. Okay. All right, the next thing that I want to show you guys is some of the things that I've learned teaching workshop. This is actually from my blog. So you can read it online as well as here. Let me share this with you. And then I will project it on the screen. Okay, so here's the deal. When I taught my first undergraduate poetry workshop a few years ago, I was thrilled about the opportunity to foster creative writing and to teach my students all new exciting things. I expected to be excited about my students' work and about my own work, and to daily emulate my favorite professors. And it was all that. However, I didn't expect to learn how to be more compassionate and considerate, and I did. No, I'm not saying that all people should be treated like undergraduates in a poetry workshop. That's not it at all. Nor am I saying that all workshops should conduct themselves in a considerate fashion at all times. Even deserving criticism is criticism. And yes, I learned more on that the day Maury Creech, my former professor, ripped up my workshop poem than I did on any other day that year, but that was graduate school. The point I'm trying to make is that undergraduates have a lot of feelings, and from leading poetry workshops, I've learned a few things about being considerate of a lot of feelings. First, remember that someone has worked very hard, maybe even sacrificed something for whatever you're critiquing. This is actually when it's hardest for me to accept criticism, when I've worked really hard on something and it hasn't turned out as well as it was supposed to. It's obviously good to be conscious of that feeling in others. Next, eye contact, which you don't have to deal with so much online, but you should still know this. Eye contact should be given and received and avoided with genuine intention. During workshop and even class discussion, I try to make eye contact with all of my students, those speaking and listening, so that they're equally privileged as both communicating to each other as well as with me. I found that giving direct criticism during office hours requires direct eye contact, but sometimes in workshop settings, it's easier to ignore the writer so that they can observe that their work is being discussed. Either way, be aware of what your eyes are doing. Be aware in your comments on the discussion board whether you're talking directly to the other writers or you're talking about their writer's work. Do what's easiest for you and what you feel is the most considerate. Make sure that your tone of voice, even the tone of your writing, and make sure to be careful of it and know that it can be easily misinterpreted. I'm Italian, so this is one of my faults. I tend to yell. I have a student who has a brash voice this semester, or the semester that I wrote this. So I'm usually reminded to keep my tone controlled. As a woman, this doesn't mean that I use my baby voice, but it does mean that I'm avoiding too bossy of a tone. So you want to be a little more in your workshop comments instead of being incredibly direct and concise. That might make you come off as less brash. Next, never ask feedback on something you can't hear feedback on. You shouldn't do this in a workshop or to your partner. Hello, if you're feeling fat, don't ask if you look fat. Really, this is hard to learn because we all do it, so keep reminding yourself. We're going to talk about your responsibilities in workshop as a writer according to the rubric in a second. But one of the biggest things to remember is not to let someone review your work that you're not ready to show. So don't dwell in your workshop comments either. This is really hard to control when there's a group of people who all want to reiterate their opinions. But hearing that the grammar needs to be corrected once is fine. But after hearing that you wrote rains instead of rains 5 times, you'll start to doubt your ability to read, much less write. Nitpicky comments need to be kept to a minimum, or as I like to do in undergraduate workshop, keep them to your written comments and say them once. Also, read what everybody else has written. Don't beat a dead horse. The horse won't die again. That's usually when feelings do get hurt. Okay. And as this is true for workshop and life, if you can't point out the asshole in the room, make sure it isn't you. That also means that you need to, when you're commenting on other people's work, carefully read the others' comments in workshop. Okay. All right, so let's look back at what your responsibility is if you are the one whose work is being critiqued. So if you are the author, you want to listen to or read the critique carefully, avoiding any desire to defend your choices. If you're unclear about what the reviewer means, ask him or her to clarify. You can do that in a workshop or you can do that in an email. Either is fine. If after hearing and reading the critique you have questions, feel free to pose them to the group. You can also ask me. For example, if you're concerned that a particular passage is confusing, not quite believable, or superfluous, you might say, do you feel it's necessary to the script to include the scene where Sally talks to her mother about her dog's death? I debated whether to cut it or not. That's great. Take special note of repeated commentary on the same issue. This might signify a major area for improvement. Thank the readers for their feedback. If some commentary is especially helpful, it's useful information to the reviewer. Different writers have different strengths and different reviewers have different strengths too. That's why we do workshop. Also, remember that it's your writing. You are the ultimate decision maker on what goes into the piece. You do not have to accept any suggestion for improvement if you do not want to. However, at the same time, don't just dismiss those suggestions out of hand or immediately. For example, reviewers might suggest that iambic pentameter of your sonnet is not as tight and rhythmic as it might be. Try creating a fresh draft of the poem and rewrote several syllables to achieve the proper pentameter, which we're not focusing on this semester, but you're welcome to write a meter if you would like to. If possible, allow some time before you read it again. You may be surprised with the results. Also, remember too that no writer is universally loved. Accept the negative feedback that comes with the territory. Your job is not to make everyone happy, but to make your writing the best that it can be. Okay, so what you guys need to make sure you're doing is that you're submitting constructive criticism for at least 2 of your peers. That's what you're going to be graded on. I'm looking for good analysis, so that you clearly analyze the work of your peer and demonstrate that you actually understand what they're trying to say and how it relates to course concepts. That you identify both the strengths and weaknesses of the piece. That you give highly contextual, concrete suggestions for areas that need improvement. So like I said before, not just general. Focus on the person's work, not the person, and frame this in a positive tone. And then make sure the organization is sound and the ideas flow logically. Also, make sure that you carefully proofread like everything, even your workshop comments. Okay, so good. If you guys have any questions about workshops, just let me know. I'm happy to help you. I'm going to look again tomorrow. I don't think anyone has started workshopping each other yet. I would also really like to see you workshopping someone's poem who hasn't been workshopped already. There aren't quite enough people in this class. So make sure that you're giving attention to everyone in the class. You don't want to be the one left out. You also don't want to leave someone else out. Okay, now let's talk about those final portfolios. Here's the deal. At the end of the term, you're going to be asked to revise 2 of your pieces of writing and create a portfolio. The rubric is online and you can pull it up in Blackboard, but I'm just going to talk about it really fast so that you know. So as we're writing these in these different genres, what you're going to do is you're going to write 1 poem, 1 memoir, 1 short story, and 1 screenplay. You're going to have the opportunity to revise 2 of those. You are welcome to revise all 4. I am more than happy to give you comments on all 4 if that's what you want. But you must revise 2. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put together a fairly professional portfolio. It will include a cover page with a title, your name, course number, and your contact information. It should include a table of contents, and then it should also include those 2 assignments of your choice. You're also going to write, which this is sometimes the most challenging part of this portfolio in addition to those comments. You're also going to write a 2 to 3 paragraph author biography, so a biography of yourself. This should be written in 3rd person. You can include whatever details are important. I can give you a few examples of bios if you remind me, but usually I do a combination of Angelina O'Brien lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, and has an MFA from McNeese State University. I do a combination of that with something like, she often sits at her desk and stares out her window and tries to write something. So you can have a little bit of fun with those portfolios, okay? So just know that that's what's coming. That's what our ultimate goal is. That is the largest percentage of your course grade. You are going to be revising those documents so that you can include them in your portfolio. Again, you must include 2. You may include all 4 if you would like to, but know that that's coming. Okay. All right, so as a quick refresher, let's look back over what we discussed today. We discussed reading poetry and how you should read like a writer. We discussed imagery. We discussed imagery. We talked about imagery from last week, and we also sort of added some new thoughts about it. We talked about voice and how you're going to be working with voice next week, and then how you're going to be working with voice later, and how you can recognize it in the poems that you are going to critique, as well as how you can work on it in your own poetry. we are going to talk, or we talked about form, so maybe the most important aspects of form this time. We also talked about writing poetry and gaining confidence in your own writing. And we talked about workshop expectations as well as your final portfolios. And that is it for today. I noticed a few people just dropped in. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording for right now and let you know that my office hours are going to start. I'm also going to post a copy of this on Blackboard as well as of the PowerPoint that I went through today. Please let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to hearing from you guys. Bye.